And where last, yes.
Quick question. When you start writing on the bottom boards, do you mind kind of putting it like halfway so that when you are writing like at the bottom of the second board?
Oh, a little higher.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just remind me if I forget.
Okay.
But yes, I'll try to remember to do that.
Thank you.
Okay, any others? All right, then. When we last left our heroes, we were talking about blood, and we had gone through the components of blood and all the different things in blood and how blood clots. The only thing we really didn't get to is leukocytes, which we're not going to get to because they are way complicated, and I just had to choose something to drop, and it's going to be that. So if you take micro, they'll teach you more than you ever wanted to know about leukocytes in there. Probably not more than you ever wanted to know. Immunology is kind of awesome.
It's amazing.
Yeah, immunology is really, really cool. So look into that further if you can. But we're going to go tonight to the heart. So to begin with, drawing the heart in a anatomy and phys class is a little bit difficult because this is not a good way to draw it. This looks very, very little like an actual heart. So I go with this. There. Looks a little bit more like the heart, and it has a few characteristics which are helpful when you're doing this. Okay, so first of all, it makes it clear that the heart is comprised of 4 chambers organized into 2 separate pumps. You've got one side over here, another side over here, and when I call this the left side, it is not because I do not know my right from my left, although that did take me a while. It's because you're talking anatomical position, and you're as if it's mine. Now, was anybody else one of those people who, I don't know how you folks were left from right, but when I was a kid, my parents would say, okay, conductor, yeah, which one makes the L? That's the left. And so until I was like 14, every once in a while, yeah, it's kind of funny how that can be very hard for many humans. But anyway, back to this. So left side, right side. Upper chambers are the atria, singular atrium. Lower chambers are the ventricles. Blood comes to the heart, to the left and right atria. Okay, sorry. From the atria, blood is moved down into the ventricles, and then from the ventricles, it goes back out through the top of the heart, through major arteries leaving the heart. There. Between the atria and the ventricles is this layer of connective tissue, sometimes known as the base of the heart. One of the reasons I prefer this diagram is because it makes it clear that the base is pretty much one sheet that goes across the whole heart. And in that sheet, there are one-way valves made with flaps of tissue that make sure that the flow through the heart is in the right direction. So from the atria to the ventricles, we have these flaps that form the atrioventricular valves, which only allow blood to flow from the atria to the ventricles. Between the left atrium and the left ventricle, that valve has a bunch of different names. You are always safe calling it the left atrioventricular valve. That is always an acceptable name. You never have to use anything else. You could even probably get away with calling it the left AV valve. However, it is also known as the bicuspid or mitral valve. Bicuspid because it has 2 flaps, mitral because someone thought it looked like the funny hat worn by certain people in the Catholic Church, the mitered cap. Seriously. I don't know enough about Catholicism to know who wears mitered caps. Does anybody? I'm not a Catholic. Is it
cardinals that
cardinals that wear that one? There you go. So, the right atrioventricular, over here, also known as the tricuspid, because it has 3 flaps, and apparently does not look enough like a hat for anyone to have given it another name. You can also always call it the right atrioventricular if you're not sure. Good, questions there. The mitral seems to be mostly a medical term. You hear that a lot in medical circles. People talk about mitral valve prolapse and things like that. There's some effort to standardize names, and people tend to resist it with the older mite because the old names are kind of fun. But anyway, at the exits from the ventricles, we have other one-way valves that only allow blood flow to flow out from the ventricles into the main arteries leading the heart. These are the semilunar valves. So named because the valves look like little half moons. The left semilunar, which is between the left ventricle and the main artery leading it, called the aorta. It's the aortic valve, logically enough. Left semilunar is also acceptable. The right semilunar, which is between the right ventricle and the main arteries leading here. Probably the best word for that is pulmonary trunk, but I usually just call it pulmonary arteries. Is the pulmonary valve. Are there any questions on any of that? Okay, so the pattern of blood flow through the heart is, doesn't matter which side you start with, but let's start on the right side. Blood comes to the heart, to the right atrium, through the right atrioventricular or tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle, out through the right semilunar or pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries. Coming back from there, it's going to go to the lungs, we'll get to that in a bit. Coming back from there, it's going to go to the left atrium, through the left atrioventricular or bicuspid or mitral valve, into the left ventricle, out through the left semilunar or aortic valve, into the main artery, the aorta, and from there out to the rest of the body, from whence it will eventually come back to the right atrium. So closed circulatory loop. Questions on that part? Now, on the cardiovascular exam, I am going to ask you this question. Name, everyone starts writing at that point, yes. Name the chambers and valves of the heart you would pass through in order, starting from someplace in the body and ending up returning to there. Yes. So the question will be something along the lines of, name the chambers and valves of the heart you will pass through in order. If you started from, then name some place in the body and return to that same place.
And what would an example be, like
Starting the liver.
oh,
Okay, so if we start in the liver, and we haven't done this yet, but we will in a moment, you're in what we call the systemic circulation, which means, actually the liver's probably not the best choice for this, but it's somewhere in the systemic circulation. We're going to be coming back to the right atrium. So the answer would be right atrium, right atrioventricular, or tricuspid, whichever one you want to use. Name, valve. Right ventricle, right semilunar, or pulmonary valve. That's going to take you to the lungs. It's going to bring you back to the left atrium, left atrioventricular, or bicuspid, or mitral valve. Left ventricle, left semilunar, or aortic valve. And back into the systemic circulation and back to where you started from. That question will be asked. So be ready for that. Okay. Any questions?
Are you going to want us to include the inferior and superior vena cava? Because if you're coming from the liver.
The question says, name the chambers and valves of the heart.
Okay.
You only ever have to answer the question as asked. Including x-rays won't cost you anything unless you're wrong. If you include extra incorrect information, you can lose points for it. Okay. Questions? All right, so let's put this in context with the rest of the circulatory system. As we just mentioned, but still. So we're going to have our heart here. All right, let's start in the left ventricle this time. So from the left ventricle, we're going to head out through that left semilunar valve into this large vessel called the aorta, which is the beginning of what we call the systemic circulation. I am not going to try to draw this in any sort of even remotely anatomically accurate manner. We're going to summarize the entire circulatory system of the body except for the lungs like this. So the systemic circulation is everything but the lungs. All internal organs, all the skin, everything except the lungs. Now, coming back from the systemic circulation, we're coming back to the right atrium. Problem is, as somebody mentioned, you actually come to here on two vessels which arrive together at the atrium. One from the upper body, the superior vena cava, and one from the lower body, the inferior vena cava. We'll just kind of combine those and call this the venae cavae, which would be the plural in Latin. And we get to the right atrium. From the right atrium, we're going to pass down through the right atrioventricular or tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, we're going to pass up through the right semilunar or pulmonary valve into the pulmonary arteries, which take us to the lungs, which collectively we're going to call the pulmonary circulation. Going to take us back to the left atrium on the pulmonary veins. And from there, down to the left ventricle where we started. So that's the human circulatory pattern in a nutshell. It's not that hard to remember if you remember a few things. Right ventricle goes to the lungs, left ventricle goes to the rest of the body. And each one goes back to the other side of the heart than the one it started with, at the atrium. I know that's on the low side. Is that still visible to everybody back there? Yeah, okay. Cheat it up slightly. Now, because everyone does this, let's go ahead and sketch in where the blood is oxygenated and deoxygenated. And I'm going to use the red and blue thing, although in actuality, as you know, if you've ever given blood or drawn blood or seen venous blood, it's not actually blue. The vessels in your hand look blue because of how certain frequencies of light are absorbed by your skin. But if you've ever had a blood draw, what color is the blood that comes out of that? Yeah, kind of purpley red. That's the color of venous blood. Has anyone ever seen arterial bleeding? Yeah, what does that look like? Bright red. Yeah, like red. Fortunately, I have only ever seen that once. So. Now, the blood becomes oxygenated in the lungs. So it's coming back from the lungs that we expect it to be bright red and oxygen rich. These new markers take a moment to kick in. So blood coming on the pulmonary veins is red, oxygenated blood. Then through the atrium, through the left ventricle, and out into the aorta, and out to the systemic circulation. And in general, that's where it gives up oxygen. So out there in the body, it's surrendering that oxygen to the tissues, and it's going to turn kind of purple. From there, it's coming back on the systemic veins and the venae cavae, the right atrium, the right ventricle, the pulmonary arteries, and out to the pulmonary circulation. The commonly stated thing that arterial blood is red and venous blood is purple is not strictly accurate. That is true for the systemic circulation, which is the one we usually interact with, but the pulmonary circulation is the other way around. The pulmonary arteries carry the darkish blood and the pulmonary veins carry the reddish blood, just in case it ever comes up. Strictly speaking, that is not true. The term artery means vessel with a certain kind of muscular structure in its wall going away from the heart. It has nothing to do with what kind of blood it carries. Good? All clear on that one? Okay, so we have a little bit of context for how the heart relates to the circulation in the rest of the body. There's a couple of interesting things about this. One, these valves. The valves in the heart are not motorized in some way. They don't open and then close. They simply flaps. If anyone's ever looked at, in most houses or apartment buildings, the output from a clothes dryer goes through a little vent that has little flaps. It'll open as the hot, damp air is going out, but then when that stops, they close. That's pretty much how a heart valve works. They work by a pressure difference. If the pressure in the atrium is higher than the ventricle, that valve will open and blood will flow down. If the pressure in the ventricle is higher than the atrium, blood will try to flow back, and those valve flaps will catch and close, or they should. So these valves are not pulled open by anything. They are simply pushed open by pressure differences. And then when one tries to go backward, it just pushes the valve closed. That's all there is to it. The one thing that looks like an exception in the ventricles is that the flaps of the atrioventricular valves are attached by little connective tissue strings called the chordae tendineae. To muscles in the wall of the ventricle. So it almost looks like those muscles are pulling the valves open. But actually, what's happening here is that blood will flow downward through those valves. When it tries to flow back, those flaps will close. The problem is the ventricles are very powerful. And when they're squeezing hard, those valve flaps have a tendency to go pop back open into the atria. The chordae tendineae are just there to hold them, to keep them from flipping out backwards. Make sense? So if you've ever heard of heartstrings, those are the strings they're talking about. The chordae tendineae from the ends of the flaps to the small muscles in the walls of the ventricles. If you've ever heard of valve prolapse, that's what they're talking about when that doesn't work. When a valve does not close properly and starts to open backward, allowing backflow in the heart. Yes?
Is that the same thing as like a heart murmur?
It is one thing that could cause a heart murmur. A murmur comes when the valve does not close properly for some reason. I think more often it's just not quite sealing right, so you get a little bit of backflow. Prolapse is a serious backflow. Minor heart murmurs don't usually need correction. Major ones, if you're losing enough blood backward, have to be corrected surgically. Heart valves are kind of cool. They are a part which wears out in the human body, and so they are a subject for replacement. And people have replaced human heart valves with human heart valves from cadavers. or with pig valves, which happen to be about the right size and shape and fit just about right, or artificial ones. Currently, the artificial designs look almost like a little throttle body in the car. They've got a couple of mechanical flaps that open and close. But my favorite version was a little bird cage with a ball in it. So that ball couldn't fit through this ring. You put the valve in like that, blood could flow down and would push the ball into the cage and flow past it. But as soon as the blood tried to flow back, the ball would get stuck in the ring and blood couldn't flow back. Then it actually had fabric around the side which could be sewn into the base of the heart. Last I heard, I don't think they still use this design, but people with this or some of the other kind of mechanical flaps, if you listen carefully in a quiet room, you can actually hear the heart valves clicking in their heart as the ball or the valves go like that. Kind of neat. Okay. Any other questions on that? I think in the other room I actually have a version of one of those valves we can look with. Okay. So we've got the heart, we've got it in context. Let's talk about what it's made of. So aside from some connective tissue, the heart is largely made of cardiac muscle. The third type of muscle that we really haven't talked about much yet. If you remember, this is the kind where the cells are striated, generally mononucleated, and branched. So the cells form an interconnected network. Now, those striations are very much like the ones in skeletal muscle, A bands, I bands, Z lines, and all of that, which tells you something about how the actin and myosin are arranged in these cells. These are arranged in sarcomeres, just like skeletal muscle, which means when they contract end to end. They pull inward. Since they're branched, that means they're going to be pulling in and pulling on several other cells at the same time. Still, when they contract, they twitch in the same mechanical way as skeletal muscle does, as opposed to smooth muscle. That also suggests they probably use a troponin-tropomyosin system to turn the contractions on and off, which they do. Their process of excitation-contraction coupling is slightly different than skeletal. We'll get into the details on that in a moment. But they are significantly shorter than skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle cells can be quite long. They can go over most of the length of a skeletal muscle. These cells are much shorter, which means they have to join one onto the other at structures like this called intercalated discs. And let's think for a moment and see if we can figure out what we expect to find at these intercalated discs. Think about what has to happen in the heart. When the heart contracts, I probably don't want this to work like skeletal muscle does. Having lots of individual fibers, each of which is twitching out of sync with the others, or even in just one big twitch. But each one would have to be controlled by a separate motor neuron, or at least in motor units. That seems problematic. That seems like it would be real easy to get different parts of the heart out of sync with each other. In order to get the heart to work as a coherent whole, we probably don't want to have it controlled by motor neurons and motor units. Instead, we should take a page from smooth muscle. What was the name for the kind of smooth muscle that worked together in big chunks? Single unit, exactly. And what was different between single and multi-unit smooth muscle?
They were linked by gap junctions.
Gap junctions. Yeah, they had those special channel proteins which allowed materials from one cell to flow directly into the next. It would make a lot of sense if cardiac muscle cells at their intercalated discs had gap junctions, so that a signal in one cell could move directly into the next. In other words, they might behave a little bit like single unit muscle, which would make a lot of sense, really. Now here's another problem. You and I are going to be two cardiac muscle cells. Now, when I say go, bend your elbow as if you're contracting. Go. Okay, do you see the problem? All of the heart just shredded itself into several million individual cells when it tried to beat. Not going to work very well. All right, try this. Put out one finger. Okay, go. Not strong enough. A simple connection between the cells isn't going to be strong enough. Okay, go. Yeah, there we go. All right, so we're going to need a powerful connection between these cells. Mechanically, a strong connection so that when the heart beats and these cells all contract, they don't just pull apart from each other. So somewhere in that intercalated disc, there's probably going to be some kind of very strong connection. In fact, I'm guessing it's not just going to be in the membrane. Because I mean, imagine if we did this, instead of just doing this, I actually took some super glue. Okay, so now we sit here for a minute, and now we're super glued together, and now we go. We'd probably be able to separate. It'd probably take a little skin off, and it would be unpleasant, which is why we don't do this demonstration. But if it's just in the membrane, cardiac muscle cells are pretty strong, and I'm guessing that they'd be able to pull those membrane proteins apart. So we're going to need to see if we can find something a little sturdier to connect these things. So here's our two cardiac muscle cells meeting at an intercalated disc. We already decided that we're probably going to find gap junctions. So let's go ahead and draw those. There. Some gap junctions in there so that signals can flow from one cell directly into the next. Now we're also going to want some nice, strong cell-to-cell connections. That's going to have to start with some membrane proteins at least. So here, each of these cells put out a big membrane protein which will latch onto the next membrane protein. These are called desmosomes. But we still have the problem that if these pull, you're either going to break the desmosomes apart or just rip them out of one cell or the other. The embedding in the membrane is not that strong. So in the end, these desmosomes do something interesting. We've talked a little bit about the cytoskeleton. People remember that term? A network of various kinds of filaments and tubules within the cell that give it its internal shape and structure. That cytoskeleton ties on to these desmosomes. That drawing kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies. Little spiders that live in the corner. Cellar spiders, daddy long legs, I think they're called out here, those slow moving ones. Okay, if I draw this is total aside, but with two real long skinny ones kind of waving around. Does that look familiar to anybody? Anybody who grew up in the East, South, or Midwest has seen these. These are what I grew up calling daddy long legs. That's not life size, fortunately, but they can get pretty big. Yeah, so you've seen them before. They have big leg spans. Yeah, like completely harmless. Absolutely harmless to humans, except that I hurt myself getting away from them. Scared the hookies out of me as a kid. Anyway, kind of looks like one if you squished it. But yeah, you may have heard the rumor that the corner spiders are like the deadliest spider in the world. They just can't bite through human skin or something.
Yeah.
False. I mean, yes, they are venomous. All spiders are venomous, but it's hard to get them to bite, and if you do, it causes like mild irritation. They're beneficial spiders. They're useful, just try to ignore them. But mostly what they bite are other pests. I know, that's the problem.
If you overspray those spiders, you get tick prone.
Oh, so
They eat tick mites.
they're good for tick mite. They eat a whole lot of pests. So, and the nice thing is they move very slowly. So mostly just ignore them. Anyway, so these desmosomes are attached to the cytoskeleton so that when this cell pulls, it's not just pulling on that membrane protein, it's pulling on the entire cytoskeleton of that cell. So this ties these cells together quite thoroughly. This would be a little bit like if we came up and fist bumped and then bones grew between our hands. So when I pull on you, I'm pulling on the entire skeletal structure of your arm. We're not coming apart. Make sense? Groovy. Take 5.